Imagine giving up your entire life for someone else's success, only to be told you're no longer needed. 40 years of loyalty erased with a sentence. But what happens when the one who was dismissed quietly becomes the one who holds all the power? Stick around and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for the rest of this story. I still remember the weight of that night. Not just the words, but the silence that followed. Silence so thick, it felt like a wall closing in around me. I was sitting on the edge of his bed. The same one I had made every single morning for the last 40 years. The sheets were freshly laundered. I'd just folded the corners military tight like Richard liked. That's what I was doing when he walked in, his hands casually in the pockets of the expensive slacks I'd bought him last Christmas. "Maggie," he said, not looking at me, "you need to pack your things." I laughed, actually laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't laugh back. "Sarah deserves respect," he added, calm, cold. So matter-of-fact it felt rehearsed. "She's my wife now." I didn't even hear the rest. My ears started to ring. My heart didn't race. It stopped, just stopped. I stared at him, not believing, not understanding. I'd given this man my youth, my strength, my entire adulthood. I'd stood behind him as he built his clinics, as he shook hands and made deals, as people praised his ambition, never knowing it was my hands doing the dirty work behind the scenes. My savings that paid for the first building. My name on half the loans, my back that bent to keep it all together. And now I was being told I was no longer part of the story. Just dismissed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stood up slowly like I'd aged 30 years in 1 second, and I walked to the closet. He handed me a check, a ridiculous amount, as if I were some long-time employee being let go. Enough for a month or two in a motel, maybe. Certainly not enough for what I had sacrificed. "I'll have someone come by for the rest of your things," he said. I packed a single suitcase, just clothes, no photos, no memories, nothing to hold on to. And I left that house without saying goodbye to anyone. Not to Richard, not to Nathan, who once called me Mom, but hadn't so much as returned a phone call in years. Not even to the dog, who probably already loved Sarah more than he ever loved me. It was just me, a navy suitcase with a broken wheel, and a Charleston night that suddenly felt foreign and cold. I thought about going to a hotel, but the thought of handing over that pitiful check at a reception desk made me feel sick. I took a bus to my sister's place instead. Gina opened the door with one eyebrow already raised. Her home smelled like lavender and judgment. She looked at my suitcase, then at my face. "What happened?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already assumed it was my fault. "Richard remarried," I said. Just that. She didn't invite me in right away. She didn't hug me. She stared at me for a second too long. "Well," she finally muttered, stepping aside. "Guess I shouldn't say I told you so. She always said I'd wasted my life on a man who never really saw me. I used to defend Richard, fiercely. Not anymore." Gina gave me a guest room that smelled like old furniture and forgotten holidays. I stayed up all night, staring at the ceiling, wondering who I was now. I was no job, no home, no children, just a name that no longer fit in anyone's story. The next morning, she pushed a cup of black coffee into my hand and asked, "What are you going to do now?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. The week that followed was brutal. Gina's tolerance had a short fuse, and her husband kept making little comments at dinner. "So, you ever going to get back on your feet? What were you doing all those years, just cooking and ironing? And worst of all, it's not like you had kids to raise." I wanted to scream, but I stayed silent. I always stayed silent, until I couldn't take it anymore. One morning, I left a thank you note and took a bus downtown. I had a few resumes folded in my purse, handwritten, because I didn't even have a laptop. I walked into the small library near the historic district. The woman behind the counter was maybe 35, her face tired but kind. I asked if they were hiring. She told me they needed someone part-time. Front desk, minimum wage. I took it, and that's where I started over. The days at the library passed slowly. I shelved books, answered phones, helped older ladies print recipes. No one knew who I was, and for the first time in a long time, I found peace in being invisible. But something inside me stayed sharp, awake. Richard had discarded me like yesterday's news, but I wasn't done yet, and I knew, deep down, there were things buried in my past, documents, details, pieces of truth that I hadn't looked at in years. So one evening, after my shift ended, I went back to the small storage unit I'd rented with part of that pathetic check. I opened the box labeled Old Files, and that's when I found it. The paper that wasn't supposed to exist. My name. My signature. But I never signed that. Never. I stood there, the fluorescent light above me buzzing like static as the truth settled into my bones. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, and I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. It's strange how quickly people can forget everything you've done for them. Gina's voice still echoed in my ears even days after I left her house. You were always too soft, Maggie. Always waiting for someone to validate you. You gave him your life, and what did you get in return? A goodbye and a pity check? I couldn't argue. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't kind either. I moved into a small basement apartment a few blocks from the library. The walls were thin, and the faucet dripped no matter how tightly I turned it. The radiator groaned like it was in pain, and the paint peeled from the corners of the ceiling. But it was mine. The money was almost gone by then, so I started walking everywhere to save what little I had. I ate ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever was on sale at the corner store. I didn't complain. I didn't expect comfort anymore. At the library, no one asked about my past, and that suited me just fine. I watched the world pass by through the tall front windows, watched mothers hush noisy toddlers, students collapse onto beanbags with textbooks, and older women gather for their weekly book club in the community room. I kept my head down, filed returns, answered phones, said yes ma'am and no sir until my tongue was dry. I was a shadow among strangers, but it was in that quiet routine that I started to breathe again. I met Miss Emma, a retired school teacher who came in every Thursday to check out historical fiction. She always wore bright scarves and had a laugh that echoed through the building. She didn't ask many questions. She just talked about her cat, her hip replacement, the weather, and for some reason, I liked listening. One day she said, "You've got kind eyes, sweetheart," like someone who's seen too much and still kept soft. I nearly cried right there behind the desk. I realized something then. No one had said anything kind to me in months, maybe years. Even so, I still didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not about Richard, not about Sarah, not about the 40 years that had vanished like a bad investment. It was too humiliating. Sometimes I'd sit in my little apartment at night and run through memories like they were courtroom evidence, trying to justify what I'd given up, trying to measure how much of my life had really been mine. Richard used to say, "You're the glue, Maggie. You hold it all together." Funny. Turns out even glue gets scraped off when it's no longer needed. One Friday evening, I got home with aching feet and a headache from too many phone calls. I dropped my purse on the floor and sat down on the only decent piece of furniture I owned, a love seat with a squeaky spring, and stared at the stack of boxes I hadn't touched since I moved in. Something made me stand up. Maybe it was restlessness. Maybe it was instinct. I opened one of the boxes and pulled out an old binder. Inside were papers from years ago. Bank statements, loan documents, medical records. Half of it was outdated junk. Then I saw it, a manila envelope labeled Hill Property, Deed and Transfer. I froze. The Hill property was land my parents had left to me, a small patch of wooded land outside Columbia. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Always had been. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document. There it was. My name, Margaret E. Hill. My signature at the bottom. Except it wasn't mine. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My hands trembled as I scanned the rest of the document. It was a property transfer. It said I had given Richard full ownership of the land 10 years ago, that I had signed over the deed willingly. Only I hadn't. I knew my own signature. I'd written it 1,000,000 times. This wasn't it. I sat there in the silence, the fluorescent kitchen light humming above me, and stared at the lie written in ink. He stole from me. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just emotional abuse or neglect. This was fraud. My land, my name, my trust, all manipulated behind my back. My mind raced, flipping back through memories like an old Rolodex. I remembered vaguely, years ago, Richard asking me to sign some papers. He'd said it was for tax purposes. I was busy, distracted. I trusted him. Of course I did. I felt sick. How much more had I missed? I put the envelope back down and stood up, pacing the room like a trapped animal. My skin felt too tight, my heart thudding in my chest. All the humiliation, the exile, the years wasted. It was more than betrayal now. It was theft. And suddenly, something shifted inside me. A cold, quiet determination settled in my chest like a stone dropped in water. No splashing, no dramatics, just stillness. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I wasn't going to scream or demand justice. I was going to watch, learn, plan. I'd spent 40 years holding everything together while Richard got the glory. Now I would take it all back, piece by piece, and I would do it without ever raising my voice. Because a storm doesn't need to be loud to destroy everything in its path. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay on the love seat, fully dressed, the document sitting on the table in front of me like a snake coiled to strike. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that signature, that forged signature, mocking me. My mind wouldn't stop spinning, unraveling memories I had ignored, dismissed or forgiven over the years. What else had he done? What else had I let him get away with? By morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. Not like all the other things I had swallowed over the years. The quiet insults, the backhanded dismissals, the way he had started introducing me as just Margaret at events, like I was an assistant instead of his wife. The way he told people I was never much into business, even though I was the one who managed the books for the first 3 clinics while he played golf with investors. I made a list of everything I had stored away in my memory, financial documents, loan applications, deeds. I started going through the rest of the boxes, pulling out anything with numbers, names, signatures. And that's when I found the second one. Another document, another transfer. This time, a power of attorney form, dated 8 years ago, supposedly giving Richard the right to act in my name for all financial matters. I sat down slowly, holding the paper like it was radioactive. I had never seen it before, never signed it, but there was my name, my forged signature again. He didn't just steal from me once. He'd built a system around it, quiet, clean, hidden behind marriage vows and just sign this real quick moments. And I had let him. I wasn't stupid. I was trusting, and there's a difference. The next morning, I called Claire. Claire Bennett had been my roommate for 2 semesters in college, back when I still thought I'd go into journalism. Life took us down different roads, but we kept in touch on birthdays and holidays. Last I heard, she'd become a lawyer in Colombia, handling estate law and elder advocacy cases. I didn't tell her everything over the phone, just that I needed to talk, and she didn't hesitate. She invited me over that Saturday. I wore a beige cardigan that made me look older than I felt, and brought the documents in a plastic grocery bag, because nothing about this was polished. Claire greeted me with a warm hug. She looked like someone who had carved out her own corner of the world and refused to apologize for it. Her house was filled with plants and the scent of fresh coffee. I laid the documents on her kitchen table, one by one, and watched her expression change from curiosity to concern to something like controlled fury. "Maggie," she said, pointing at the power of attorney, "if this wasn't signed by you, this is felony fraud. Straight up." "I know," I whispered. She asked me a dozen questions. When I first noticed things, what role I played in his business, how the assets were divided. I answered everything. With every word, I felt lighter and heavier at the same time. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "You have a case," she said, "and it's bigger than you think." I didn't smile. I wasn't ready for victory. I just wanted to understand what he had done to me. Claire agreed to help me, but she also warned me. Taking legal action meant going public. It would get messy. It would get loud. That's when I told her what I was planning. Not lawsuits, not tabloids, not headlines. "I want the truth to come out," I said, "but not through courts, not with me front and center. I want it to unravel around him, quietly, slowly. I want people to start asking questions he can't answer." Claire raised an eyebrow. "A silent takedown?" I nodded. She smiled. "That's the Maggie I remember." Over the next week, I began gathering everything. Every receipt, every email, every bank notice, every note scribbled on a napkin. I'd been dismissed as useless for so long that Richard had never imagined I was keeping track. But I had, subconsciously, out of habit, out of fear, out of love, maybe, at some point. Now, all those fragments would become the pieces of something else entirely. I worked nights after my shift at the library, sorting and cataloging, building a quiet arsenal. I bought a cheap laptop at a pawn shop and created burner email accounts. I scanned documents. I took photos. And then, on a rainy Tuesday, I opened a fresh document and gave it a name: The Real History of Richard L. Morgan. Because if I was invisible for 40 years, it was time someone finally saw what I'd seen all along, and I wasn't done digging yet. Not even close. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be spending my nights scanning documents and investigating the man I once called my husband, I would have laughed and called them dramatic. But there I was, sitting on the floor of my tiny apartment with a legal pad in one hand, a glass of lukewarm tea in the other, and my laptop humming beside me like a secret I was finally ready to tell. Claire had shown me how to search public records, property sales, business filings, tax liens, court dockets. I started slow, searching Richard's name, then his business partner, then Morgan Health Enterprises, LLC. I traced ownership histories, scanned deed transfers, followed money trails that always seemed to land in Richard's lap, even when the original assets were in my name. It was like peeling wallpaper and finding mold underneath. He hadn't just used me, he'd built his empire on me. One night I stumbled across an old mortgage agreement it was for the building that became his first clinic. The mortgage was secured with collateral listed under my maiden name, Margaret Elaine Hill. A small notation at the bottom read, "Borrower's spouse authorizes asset assignment." That was me. Except, once again, I had never signed it. How many times had he done this? How many documents had he forged while I cooked dinner or folded his laundry or waited in the car outside his meetings? It made me nauseous to think about it, but it also gave me purpose. Claire and I began piecing everything together. She didn't file anything yet, at my request. I wasn't ready for that kind of war. What I wanted was control. I wanted every piece of the puzzle before I made my move. The real breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon at the library. I was restocking the shelves when I overheard two women chatting near the new arrivals table. They were talking about Richard, about how he always had a heart for the community, how he helped open that free clinic for single mothers, how he just married that sweet young woman, Sarah. Lucky guy. Something inside me snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't scream, but I felt it, the tightening in my chest, the heat crawling up my neck. People loved him. They believed him, and I was just a footnote in his biography. That night, I opened my laptop and started writing letters. Not to lawyers, not to police, to people. Former employees, real estate agents, investors, journalists, council members. I wrote anonymously, calmly. I attached a few scanned documents, nothing overwhelming, just enough to sow a seed of doubt. I signed them only with the initials MEH. Then I sent them from burner accounts, one by one. The next day, I wrote more. It became a routine. I'd spend my mornings shelving books and saying hello to sweet old ladies, and my nights unraveling a life built on lies. It felt poetic, quiet justice. One email turned into 3. 3 turned into 20. I didn't expect immediate results. But the thing about secrets is, once they're out there, they spread. And Richard had a lot of them. One day, Claire called me and said, "I think I found something." She sent me a scanned copy of a will. Not mine, not Richard's. My mother's, the will I thought was destroyed after probate. Claire circled a line in red. All real property to be transferred solely to my daughter, Margaret Hill. But according to county records, that land had transferred to Richard less than 2 months after my mother's passing. The signature on the release form? Forged. By him. He hadn't just used me. He'd reached back through my family line, stealing from a woman who trusted him like a son. That was when I stopped hesitating. The plan shifted. This wasn't just about getting even. This was about telling the truth, my truth, and making sure no one else could ever call him a hero again. I updated the digital file I'd started, The Real History of Richard L. Morgan, and renamed it The Empire Built on My Silence, because that's what it was. He succeeded because I never spoke up, but I was done being quiet. I wasn't going to take him to court. I was going to take him apart, one lie at a time. There's something haunting about watching your own life unfold in front of you like evidence at a crime scene. Night after night, I sat at that wobbly kitchen table surrounded by folders, receipts, emails, and legal copies. Every paper I touched seemed to whisper a story I had forgotten, or chosen to forget, out of love, loyalty, or just plain survival. But now, I listened. I wasn't the same woman who stood silent in the face of betrayal. I was becoming something else, and they didn't even see it coming. Everyone thought I had disappeared, that I was living out my days knitting in the dark, waiting for someone to care. But I was watching, I was remembering, and most of all, I was learning. I began visiting people from Richard's past, starting with the ones he thought had vanished into the background just like I had. Old clinic staff, construction workers, receptionists, secretaries. People forget how much power quiet people have. I met with Denise, who used to manage the front desk at his first clinic. We sat at a tiny cafe off Meeting Street. She looked older, but just as sharp as ever. She was cautious at first, but when I brought up Richard's name, something flickered in her eyes. "Why do you want to know?" she asked. I didn't lie. Because he destroyed my life, and I'm finally doing something about it. She sat back in her chair, stirred her tea, and after a long pause said, "Good." Then she told me things I never knew, about payments that didn't match the books, about a vendor who was paid double what they were owed, then disappeared, about whispers of offshore accounts that no one ever dared to confirm. It wasn't just emotional manipulation or fraud. It was calculated, and Richard had counted on my silence to keep it all under wraps. But there was something else, something Denise said as she stood up to leave that stuck with me. "You know," she said, "he once told me he couldn't have done any of it without you." It wasn't a compliment. It was a confession. I left the cafe shaken. I'd always assumed I was the collateral damage in Richard's climb to the top. But the truth was worse. I had been the foundation, the one he built everything on. The next day, I went to see Claire again. I brought everything I had. Notes, files, scanned documents, recordings from the meetings I'd started to document. She was stunned by the scope of it all. "You've basically built a case," she said. "But it's more than that. This is a history." I told her I wanted to make it public, but not in my name, not yet. We created a secure folder online, set it to private, and began uploading everything under anonymous titles. Forged deeds, altered documents, timelines, employee statements, all cross-referenced, all verified. Then I started leaking pieces to local forums. Charleston had dozens, business blogs, real estate watch groups, community exposés. I crafted every post with care, speaking in generalities, tagging people Richard had worked with. I made them ask the questions for me. Isn't this the same land Morgan Health developed back in? Why does this power of attorney look off? Anyone know who MEH is? No one connected it to me. And still, I wasn't done. One evening, I visited the small attic of the house I had once called home. Not inside. It was Sarah's house now, officially. But I knew Richard hadn't bothered to clear everything out. He never did the dirty work himself. I climbed up there while Sarah was away and Richard was overseas at some conference. I still had the old garage door code. I moved quietly, like a ghost. That's where I found the file box, a plain black box labeled simply Morgan, personal. Inside, dozens of old folders, notes scribbled in Richard's messy handwriting, and one envelope that stopped me cold. It had my mother's name on it. I opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a letter, written by my mother just weeks before she passed away. She had written it to me. I had never seen it, and Richard had kept it from me all these years. In it, she said she was proud of me, that she trusted me with everything, that the land was meant to be my sanctuary, my freedom. She even warned me, subtly, that money has a way of making some men forget who they are. I sat in that attic and cried for the first time in months. Not out of sadness, but out of clarity. Richard didn't just steal my land. He stole my mother's final words, and that made this personal in a way I hadn't allowed myself to admit until now. I copied the letter, photographed every page, put everything back exactly how I found it, and I walked away. Not with vengeance in my heart, but with resolve, because now I had everything I needed, a plan, a motive, and a reason to see this through. I was no longer mourning the life I had lost. I was preparing to take it back. It started with a whisper. One anonymous post in a real estate forum titled, "Revisiting the Origins of the Morgan Health Clinics. Was there ever a paper trail?" I kept the tone neutral, just asking questions, but I embedded an image, one of the forged deed transfers that transferred my land to Richard. I didn't explain what it was. I let them wonder. Then I posted a second message in a business ethics blog. This time, I dropped a hint about forged signatures and property deals that had never gone through proper legal channels. I named no names, just dates and documents. By the next morning, the comments were alive. This sounds shady. Is this about Richard Morgan? I worked with him years ago. Wouldn't surprise me. People were guessing, and that was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't interested in shouting from the rooftops. I wanted rumors that felt just close enough to truth. Because people believe whispers more than they believe declarations. It was time to become the whisper. I created an email account under the initials MEH and started sending copies of carefully chosen documents to a small list. 2 investigative journalists, 1 ethics professor at the local university, and a blogger known for covering business scandals in Charleston. The subject line read simply, "When reputation is built on fraud." Inside, I attached the first forged document and included one sentence. "This is just the beginning." Then I vanished from the inbox. No signature, no request for a reply, no breadcrumbs. I waited, and while I waited, I kept working. I created a small burner phone and programmed it with a few investor contacts I'd remembered from galas and business dinners. Names Richard had dropped when bragging about his empire. I started texting them. Simple things, questions, suggestions. Ever wonder how Morgan Health acquired that Columbia lot back in? Check the property records for the Hill estate. I'd be careful about tying your name to Richard's next expansion. I signed nothing, but the phone calls started the next week. Not to me, to him. I knew because Claire forwarded me a clip from a voicemail she'd been sent anonymously by a contact inside the investor group. Richard audibly rattled, saying, "Someone's digging. They've got old documents." I smiled. That was the first time in 40 years I imagined him afraid. At the library, life went on. I shelved books, smiled at the regulars, said hello to Miss Emma, and helped a student find a copy of The Great Gatsby for an essay. No one had any idea what I was doing after dark. That made it even sweeter. But it wasn't just about making noise. I wanted precision, timing, so I started marking my calendar. Mondays were for document drops, Wednesdays for email leaks, Fridays for anonymous posts. It wasn't chaos, it was strategy. I leaked a scan of the power of attorney, then a copy of the bank statement showing loan funds diverted under my name. Then, my favorite, a photo of the original letter from my mother, dated and initialed, with her own handwriting clearly visible. I cropped out personal details, but left just enough to make it undeniable. The caption was simple: "A letter never delivered, a land never truly given." That post alone had over views in 48 hours. Richard's name started popping up in comment sections, always surrounded by question marks. And then came the local expose. A Charleston business blog published a story, "The Empire Beneath the Surface: What We Don't Know About Richard Morgan." They didn't accuse him directly. They just asked smart, inconvenient questions, the kind that make investors nervous. That same night, I walked past the house that used to be mine. The porch light was off, the windows dark. I wondered if Sarah was beginning to sense it too, that cold prickle when you realize something isn't right. I wondered if she'd start asking her own questions. I hoped so, because the storm was coming, and I wasn't finished yet. I was just getting started. It started with Nathan. I didn't expect that. He'd spent the last decade pretending I didn't exist. When Richard introduced Sarah as his real family and pushed me out, Nathan didn't even blink. Not a phone call, not a text, not even a shrug. I raised him. Not biologically, but I was the one who taught him how to tie his shoes, who showed up to every parent-teacher conference, who stayed up when he had a fever and made pancakes on Saturdays. Richard was too busy building empires to be a father, but I was always there, until I wasn't needed anymore, until Sarah came along and he conveniently forgot who taught him how to be kind. Or maybe he just chose not to remember. That's why I wasn't ready when he showed up. He came to the library. I was restocking the new arrivals when I saw him standing by the front desk, tall and uncomfortable in a pressed suit, like he didn't quite know how to exist without an audience. "Maggie?" he asked. I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest. He looked older, not in age. He was in his late 30s now, but in the kind of way that told me he was tired, worn, the golden child tarnished. "Can we talk?" he asked. I led him outside to the bench beneath the magnolia tree. I didn't say anything. I just waited. "There's something going on," he said. "People are whispering. Investors are pulling back. Dad's freaking out." I didn't react. He continued, voice low. Someone's leaking documents. Real ones. Stuff no one should have access to. Still, I said nothing. I thought it might be you, he said, looking at me now. Really looking. I mean, it would make sense. I stared out across the street, watching a couple walk hand in hand. Why would it make sense? He shifted. Because you know everything. You were there. You always kept the books before the accountants took over. And because Dad, he hesitated. Because Dad never really gave you credit for any of it. The air between us hung heavy. Then quietly, he added, and because I was cruel. I didn't see it before. Or I didn't want to. I turned to him, eyes sharp. You were a child. Then you became a man who mirrored him. He winced. I deserved that. No, I said. You deserved the truth. You just chose not to ask for it. He looked down at his hands. Why now? I paused, then stood. I walked over to my bag and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside, the letter I had kept hidden for years. Not the original, just a copy. The same one I'd shared with the blog, cropped and redacted. And with it, a smaller envelope, sealed in wax. I handed them to him. What is this? He asked. Your mother, I said simply. Her last words. He froze. I found it in the attic. Richard kept it from you. Just like he kept a lot of things. He opened the larger envelope first, eyes scanning the letter. I watched as his expression shifted. Confusion, disbelief, then pain. She wanted you to stay with me, I said. She trusted me to raise you. And I did. Until the man you call Dad decided I wasn't worth your time anymore. Nathan was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up, eyes glossy. Why are you giving me this? Because you deserve to know who you are, where you came from, and who protected you, even when no one else did. He opened the second envelope. Inside was a photo, the two of us at his 6th birthday. He was missing a front tooth, frosting on his chin. I was holding the cake, laughing. He said nothing, just stared. I don't want anything from you, I told him. Not apologies, not forgiveness, but I won't be your secret anymore. He stood slowly, folding the letter back into its envelope. I'm sorry, he said. I gave a half smile. Be sorry to yourself for what you let him turn you into. He nodded, and then he left. I watched him go without emotion, because this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about revelation. And now, another crack had formed in Richard's perfect little world, one that couldn't be sealed shut with lies anymore. And I had so much more left to reveal. The first time I saw Richard's face on the local news, I didn't flinch, I didn't gloat. I just sat on the edge of my bed with the volume low and my tea cooling in my hands. They didn't say his name outright, not yet, but the anchor's tone was serious. A prominent healthcare executive in Charleston is facing questions regarding property acquisitions and possible forgery connected to early business ventures. While no formal accusations have been made, documents leaked to regional watchdogs suggest a pattern of unethical, possibly illegal, behavior spanning over 2 decades. And then, in the corner of the screen, a grainy photo of Richard shaking hands at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. That was all it took, all it needed. One seed planted on live television. By morning, his office phone must have been ringing off the hook, and I knew exactly what would come next. Sarah. It wasn't hard to guess how she'd take it. She was ambitious, perfectly poised, the kind of woman who treated reputation like currency, and Richard had handed her a wallet full of counterfeit bills. I didn't hear from her directly, but I didn't need to, because 3 days later, she found me. I was shelving biographies in the back of the library when I heard heels clicking against the old wood floor. I turned, and there she was, hair slicked back, trench coat immaculate, anger radiating off her like heat in July. You, she said, her voice sharp but low enough not to draw attention. You're the one doing this. I blinked. Doing what, Sarah? She stepped closer. Don't play dumb. The letters, the documents, you're trying to ruin him. I didn't respond. She looked around, eyes flicking nervously toward the few patrons scattered across the room. Then she lowered her voice even further. Why now? After everything he did for you? After all these years? I finally met her eyes. You think he gave me something? I said. He took from me, Sarah. My money, my land, my life. He built that empire on my name, my silence, and my trust. And you? You're just the next woman he's using. She flinched just slightly. I love him, she said, but it came out uncertain. I gave a sad smile. You don't know him. She hesitated. Then, why not just move on? You could have taken the check, started over. Why go to war? I leaned in, quiet but firm. Because I spent 40 years being erased, and I won't be erased again. She didn't speak after that, just stared, as if she were trying to read me for the first time, and realizing she couldn't. Then she turned and walked out without another word. But something had shifted. I knew the look in her eyes. Doubt, and it would fester. By the end of that week, I got confirmation. An anonymous tip, forwarded to Claire, revealed that Sarah had retained a private attorney. Not for Richard, for herself. She was beginning to dig. She had access to his personal files, his safe, his private emails. And while she didn't know it, she was about to find everything I had already found, and more. Claire called me one night, voice tense with disbelief. She found the originals, she said. Deeds, letters, loan documents, even some personal recordings. He kept everything, like he never thought anyone would challenge him. I felt something stir in my chest. Not quite victory, but justice, coming into focus. Sarah didn't reach out again, but I didn't need her to, because she had seen the rot in the foundation, and she was beginning to understand just how deep it went. The walls were closing in now. Richard had spent decades controlling the narrative, the money, the people. But now, the people closest to him were watching him unravel, and all I had done was tell the truth, quietly, relentlessly, and I wasn't stopping until the whole house came crashing down. They say the truth always finds a way to the surface, but in Richard's case, it didn't float, it was dragged up, page by page, signature by signature, betrayal by betrayal. It started with Sarah. She must have waited until he was out of town again, some health tech summit in Denver, if I recall correctly. Claire's source told us Sarah entered his office at night, alone. She had the passcode to his private safe. Of course she did. She was his wife, after all. Inside, she found the black box, the one I had found weeks earlier. But she didn't just peek inside like I had. She opened every file. She read every contract, listened to every recorded phone call saved on USB drives, saw every lie, every name forged, every land deed rewritten without consent. She saw my mother's letter. She saw my name on documents I never signed. She saw the signature he had practiced until it looked like mine. And for the first time, Sarah finally understood who she had married. She took it all, photocopied it, scanned it, compiled it into a flash drive. Then she did what Richard never expected her to do. She handed it to a lawyer. Claire called me that morning, her voice electric with disbelief. She gave me everything, Maggie, she said. She came into my office, sat down and said, I didn't sign up for this. I won't be complicit. She's out. I didn't say a word. Just let the quiet wrap around me like armor, because I already knew. The house of cards had finally started to collapse. Over the next few days, things moved fast. Claire took the drive and filed an anonymous complaint with the South Carolina Department of Revenue, then with the Secretary of State's office. Then, quietly, with 2 investigative journalists from the Post and Courier who had been waiting for the green light. It was out of our hands now, but still very much in our favor. Richard returned from Denver to chaos. Silent phone calls, cold shoulders, an emergency board meeting. A legal notice slid under his office door. He must have thought he could spin it. He always did. But this time, there were too many threads, too many inconsistencies, too much proof. And worst of all, there was no villain to point to, no scandalous ex, no dramatic public accusations, no courtroom breakdown, just the quiet unraveling of decades of deceit. And I stayed silent, watched it all from a distance like a storm I didn't need to run from anymore. People began whispering in higher circles. How did he get away with it for so long? Was his wife involved? Did anyone ever meet the first woman? What was her name again? They remembered me now. Not as Richard's wife, but as the one who vanished and came back with the truth. I heard through Claire that Sarah had moved out, took only what she brought into the marriage and the flash drive that changed everything. As for Nathan, he'd gone quiet too. Rumor was, he'd begun the process of legally removing the Morgan name from his financial holdings. He hadn't called me again. I didn't expect him to, but I knew he saw it now, the lie of it all. One afternoon, I walked by Richard's clinic in the old historic district. It was shuttered. A white sheet of paper taped to the door read, "Closed for restructuring." The building looked tired, like it finally felt the weight of all it had carried. I stood there for a long moment, not satisfied, not triumphant, just still. Because it wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about truth, and the truth had finally spoken, loud enough for the world to hear. There was a moment, just one, that made everything pause. It was early morning. The air was crisp, the streets quiet. I was walking to the library with a warm cup of coffee in hand when my phone buzzed with a message from Claire. Just one line. They're publishing it today. I stood still on the sidewalk, staring at the screen like it might rewrite itself. But it didn't. That was the day my story, my truth, went public. The article came out on a local but well-respected independent blog that specialized in investigative journalism. It wasn't tabloid gossip. It was clean, factual, damning. The Empire Built on Silence, How Margaret Hill Was Erased, and How She Took Her Story Back. The title alone made me sit down on the nearest bench. I read the whole thing, slowly, breath catching at certain parts. It didn't tell every secret. It didn't need to. It laid out the timeline, how Richard Morgan acquired land and business capital through forged documents, how a power of attorney appeared under suspicious conditions, how key pieces of his empire were quietly backed by a woman he later discarded like a used handkerchief. They didn't name me as the source, but they didn't have to. The city knew, and the silence I had lived under for decades shattered like glass. I received messages that week, dozens of them. Some from strangers, some from people I hadn't heard from in years. One, from an old friend I hadn't seen since my wedding, said, "Maggie, I'm sorry I wasn't there. I didn't know. I didn't ask. I should have." But the message that caught me off guard came from the Charleston Women's Advocacy Network. They asked if I would speak at a panel about elder women's financial abuse and emotional neglect. I almost said no, but then I thought, why not me? So I said yes. The event was held at a small community center, nothing fancy. Folding chairs, plastic pitchers of water, a modest stage with two other women, one who had lost everything to a predatory caregiver, another who had been scammed by her own daughter, and then me. I stood at that podium and looked out at a room full of women with tired eyes and strong spines. Some held notebooks, some held tissues, most just held on. "My name is Margaret Hill," I said, and I was erased, slowly, quietly, and willingly, because I loved someone who taught me to shrink. I told them the truth, not every detail, but enough to make them nod, cry, reach for each other's hands, and when I finished, there was no applause, just silence. And then, one by one, they stood. It wasn't celebration. It was solidarity. And for the first time in decades, I felt like I was standing, too, not behind someone, not in someone's shadow, but as myself. Richard, meanwhile, was fighting to stay afloat. He'd sold off one of his clinics to settle quiet claims. The rest? Under audit. His reputation? In review. His board seat? Suspended. He hadn't made a public statement. Couldn't. Because how do you defend what's already unraveling? Nathan had issued his own statement, carefully worded, distancing himself, expressing regret for past complicity and gratitude to those who stood up when silence would have been easier. I didn't reply to him. I didn't need to. Some stories don't require reunion, only truth. I still lived in the same small apartment, still walked to work, still sorted books and helped teenagers with overdue fees. But now, people smiled at me differently, like they saw me, not as a victim, but as the woman who lived in silence for 40 years and then rewrote her own story. And still, I wasn't done. Because redemption doesn't come in headlines or court rulings. It comes in choices, and my final one was still waiting for me. Redemption doesn't arrive like a firework. It creeps in quietly, almost unsure of its welcome. You don't notice it at first. You're too busy watching your enemies burn, too consumed with the slow satisfaction of justice settling like dust around their polished shoes. But when it comes, it's unmistakable. Richard had vanished from the spotlight. The man who once flooded local newspapers with his philanthropy, who gave interviews about building communities, who stood behind podiums like a king anointing his kingdom, was now unreachable. His publicist issued cold statements. His board released a note of temporary leave. Translation: they were cutting ties. The Morgan name, once revered, now carried too much weight to hold up any empire. And the final blow came in an article from a national outlet, one that reached far beyond Charleston. It confirmed what we already knew. Richard was under federal investigation for fraud, misrepresentation of assets, and abuse of power of attorney privileges. His legal team had gone into crisis mode. His investors abandoned him. His clinics were being restructured, which is corporate speak for we're salvaging what's left. And in the middle of it all, Nathan did something unexpected. He hosted a dinner, a private one, just a few names, and he sent me an invitation. Claire told me I didn't have to go. You've done enough, Maggie. You don't owe anyone anything. She was right, but I went anyway. It was held at a restaurant I remembered from when Nathan was a boy. Back then, we went for special occasions, birthdays, report cards, quiet little victories. Now it was filled with people I didn't recognize, faces I'd seen in newspapers, associates, board members, partners trying to salvage dignity from what Richard had left behind. Nathan stood near the window, looking uncomfortable in a suit that probably cost more than my annual salary. When he saw me, he crossed the room in 3 long strides. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice quiet. I nodded. We didn't hug. He led me to a table off to the side, away from the others. He didn't make a speech, didn't grandstand, just handed me a small envelope. "I'm removing the Morgan name from my foundation," he said, starting over, under a different banner. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, the deed to the Hill property. My land, my family's legacy, restored. My eyes stung, but I didn't cry. Not in front of him. Not after everything. "This was never his to give," I said. "I know," Nathan replied. "I just wanted to be the one to put it back where it belongs." We didn't speak again that night, and that was fine. Closure doesn't always come in warm embraces. Sometimes it comes in the quiet exchange of a name being returned to the hands that earned it. As I left the restaurant, I looked back one last time, not at Nathan, but at the life I was walking away from. The woman who entered that building had once been invisible. The woman who walked out was anything but, and in my pocket, folded like a treasure map, was a future I was finally ready to claim. There's something sacred about untouched land. No noise, no concrete, no pretenses. Just trees that have stood longer than most promises, and earth that remembers who it belongs to. I stood there, at the edge of my parents' land, the Hill property, as the sun bled through the Carolina trees. It had taken decades to come back here, not because I couldn't, but because I thought I didn't deserve to. Because Richard made me believe I had no claim to anything beyond his shadow. But now, this land was mine again, officially, unquestionably. I'd brought only a few things with me: a folding chair, an old photograph of my mother, and a manila folder stamped with county permits. Inside were blueprints for a place I never thought I'd live to see. It wouldn't be big, just one building, a small house turned center, tucked into the trees, a safe place, a place for women who had been erased, discarded, or overlooked, just like I had been. It would be called the Lighthouse, because sometimes all we need is someone to remind us that we're still here, that we still matter. I used the settlement I received quietly, Sarah's final act of penance, perhaps. I never spoke to her again. Didn't need to. She signed over rights to avoid being dragged into the legal collapse that swallowed Richard whole. As for Richard, the last I heard, he was living alone in a condo out west. No title, no board seat, no legacy, no empire. He disappeared from the public like smoke after a fire, and I let him go. I had better things to do. Opening day came on a Saturday. Simple. No press, no ribbon cutting, just a gathering of women, some gray-haired, some young, all carrying stories that had never been heard in rooms that never listened. We sat in a circle, sipping lemonade from paper cups, sharing silence and strength in equal measure. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rehearse anything. I just stood. "My name is Margaret Hill," I said. "For 40 years, I was the backbone of something I never got credit for. I gave everything to someone who told me I was lucky just to be beside him. And when I had nothing left to give, he told me to go." I paused. But he forgot something. He forgot that women like us, we don't stay gone. We watch, we wait, and when the time is right, we rise. A soft murmur of agreement passed through the group. Heads nodded, eyes welled. "And I don't need applause," I added. "I don't need headlines. I just need you to know. You're not invisible. You never were." We didn't clap. We just sat together in the light, and I felt peace for the first time in my life, not because I had won, but because I had reclaimed my name, my voice. my worth. And as the trees swayed gently behind us, I knew my story was no longer about what I had lost. It was about what I chose to build, silently, steadily, unforgettably. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.